Hey, welcome back to CMDA Matters, the weekly podcast of the Christian Medical and Dental Associations. I'm your host, Dr. Mike Chupp, and this week I want to ask you a question. How has God redeemed the coronavirus pandemic with all of its associated hardship and suffering in your own personal, family, and professional life over the last year? Well, today I've invited two guests to the program, both who are writers, who crossed paths in Florida at a conference late in 2020 and found that each other's writing was very insightful and redemptive. One of those writers is Dr. Autumn Dawn Galbraith. She's an internal medicine physician in San Antonio, Texas, where she did her medical training. She's been an active member of CMDA since her first year of medical school and has served in leadership roles in the local San Antonio area, as well as on our Women Physicians in Christ Commission. Autumn Dawn enjoys mentoring younger physicians as well as writing and speaking. She and her husband David have 3 children, 2 are in college and 1 still at home. My other guest today is one of our virtual national convention speakers next month, author Philip Yancey, who's known for wrestling in his writing with God, with the church, and with us as fellow believers. In the process, he has authored 24 books, including the bestsellers, What's So Amazing About Grace?, a book that my own father-in-law, Wayne, found just transformative in his life and took him on a different direction away from legalism toward grace. And then the book, The Jesus I Never Knew. Yancey has worked in collaboration with surgeon and leprosy specialist Dr. Paul Brand, recently publishing the fully revised Fearfully and Wonderfully, The Marvel of Bearing God's Image. Yancey's book, Soul Survivor, includes profiles of Dr. Paul Brand and 12 others who deeply influenced his own faith. In all, his books have sold more than 15 million copies in English and have been translated into some 40 languages worldwide. Philip Yancey and his wife live in the foothills of Colorado, where they enjoy mountain climbing, skiing, wildlife viewing, and many other delights of the Rocky Mountains. You can follow his blogs and publication announcements at the site philipyancey.com, and that's with 1 L. Well, before we jump into this interview, which took place just after the incredible Texas winter blast in February, I want to give a shout out to our CMDA Director of Communications, Mrs. Mandy Morin, whose attentive review of the comments on our regular Point blog yielded a surprising discovery you're going to hear about shortly. Let's listen in. Well, it is indeed a joy and a privilege for me today not to have just one, but actually 2 guests on the program for CMDA Matters. And I'll tell you in just a minute as to how this came about. But I want to welcome to the program both longtime, well-known Christian author Philip Yancey to the program, as well as one of our long-standing members since medical school in San Antonio, Dr. Autumn Dawn Galbraith. Welcome to the program.
Thank you so much.
Indeed. It's great to be with both of you, Mike.
We're here today because Autumn Dawn is a regular contributor to our CMDA Point blog, and that's an acronym, Perspectives and Opinions on Issues and News Topics Today, especially for Christians in Healthcare. And she wrote a blog back in November entitled First, Do No Harm, and it was a blog inspired after she, I believe, traveled to Florida with her college daughter and got to hear in person one of her favorite authors down there in Florida. So our communications director noticed that after we posted this blog that there was a very unusual guest. Philip, do you normally peruse our Point blog and you read the articles, or were you just interested because Autumn Dawn was talking about your sharing in Florida?
There's this thing called Google Alerts, and whenever my name is used either in a positive way or a negative way, I get a little alert saying you were quoted in this piece. And I read the column, and I loved her honesty because she started by saying, when I first heard what Philip was going to speak on, I thought, oh my, I've had enough of this. I don't want to hear this. And then she went on and absorbed, metabolized really, this talk that I gave and took it several stages farther. So I just made a brief comment on it. Great blog.
Well, your comment, I've got it right here in front of me, was specifically, I'm glad you kept listening, Autumn Dawn, because you came up with far more insight than I dispensed. So I'm sure that made your day, Autumn Dawn.
Well, it made my day for sure, but I'm not sure how true it was. I think what I did was apply it a little more directly to healthcare, since the conference was not specifically about healthcare. But
well, to help our listeners, you were sitting there in the audience with your daughter, and Philip said, I want to talk about God and coronavirus. And you were like, oh no, this is what I have been living, somewhat of a nightmare for the last many months. I don't want to hear about coronavirus. And then Philip's talk took a turn. Why don't you just tell us what you heard that night?
Well, to preface, even to take it even a step further back, it was extra surprising because this conference had nothing to do with healthcare. It was a conference sponsored by a Christian theater organization. And I was there with my daughter, who is a theater major in college. And I took her so that she could have some exposure to this organization, which my husband and I support. So I had not attended the conference with any expectation of having any conversation about coronavirus. And in fact, had a conversation with my daughter in which I said, hopefully I don't have to tell anybody what I do so that they won't ask me any questions about coronavirus, so I can have a weekend with no conversation about COVID, which will be a nice break. So when he said, I want to talk a little bit about God and coronavirus, my heart sort of sank all the way to the floor. And I thought, you've got to be kidding me. I can't get away from this anywhere I go. So yes, it was not only sort of disappointing, but also completely surprising, because I was not in a setting in which I expected to have any discussion of coronavirus. But really what Philip was talking about was nothing related to healthcare, but he prefaced his conversation by educating this completely non-medical audience about the Hippocratic Oath, which was interesting because, of course, that's very familiar to all of us as physicians and healthcare professionals. But he started talking about how when we take our oath as we embark on our career as healthcare professionals, one of our most sacred promises is that we will first do no harm. And I was still kind of tense and bracing myself to hear some talk about, how doctors are not responding appropriately to COVID or something. And then he started talking about how Christians sometimes can do harm, and using COVID as an example of ways in which Christians may have perpetrated harm in some of our responses. So it went a totally different direction from what I initially was sort of bracing myself for. But yeah, it was a very surprising topic, and also a very surprising direction that it went, and very different from how the prior 7 or 8 months of COVID conversations had been in my life to that point.
Well, Philip, you've just heard Autumn Dawn talk about the receiver side. And clear your talk that night, the more I look at the titles of your past books, this really just sort of dovetails pretty nicely with the themes of so many of the things you've written over the past several decades. And where is God when it hurts, the problem with pain, and the church, with your background of having kind of been stung when you were young in the church that you grew up in. Give us just a synopsis of how you feel the church has done well and maybe not so well, and maybe doing some harm in this pandemic.
Right. You mentioned the background in my childhood, and that was a very formative event in my life, although I wasn't aware of it at the time. I was 1 year old, and my father had polio. That was the great pandemic everyone feared back in 1950. He was in an iron lung for 2 months, which is, a terrible thing to do to a person, just lying there staring at the ceiling, unable to do anything on his own. But that was the only way he could be kept alive. Well, there was a group of Christians, a rather large group, because my mother and father were planning to be missionaries, who were praying for him, and they became convinced that he would be healed. Why would God take a 23-year-old man, greatly devoted to God, who was planning to be a missionary in Africa at that age? And so, against all doctors' advice, and they had to actually sign the statement against medical advice, he was removed from the iron lung and moved to a chiropractic hospital, where he died about 9 days later. And these were not cruel people. These were people who loved him, who supported him, who wanted the best for him. But in their case, it was an error in theology. They took upon themselves a prerogative that was not theirs. It was God's. And they had some medical resources available that they turned down out of that leap of faith. And I saw similar things. I've been seeing similar things right now in the coronavirus, where if you do surveys, people in the church, evangelical Christians especially, are the most resistant to wearing masks, to vaccines. And I'm a member of a group called Bioethics that I'm sure you know about,
Yes,
Mike.
yes.
Founded by Francis Collins. Francis Collins is as good a scientist as there is on earth and as good a Christian as I've met on earth. And yet he has to deal constantly with pushback from the anti-science sentiments of evangelicals. So he's a prophet in the wilderness in many ways, but he's done a great service in bringing together that science is not divorced from faith. It's not an opposition. In fact, he embodies the fact that the two can work together beautifully.
Well, Autumn Dawn, one of those issues we're right in the middle of has to do with vaccine refusal or vaccine hesitancy. And, I've gotten 3 emails at CMDA in the last 24 hours from our members, some of whom are very closely associated with some of the research that went on with these COVID-19 vaccines, urging CMDA to speak truth into this situation. What has been your experience with the church and vaccine hesitancy?
Pulling from what Philip just said, I think a bigger statement to then narrow down to vaccine hesitancy, the statement that there were medical resources available to them that they chose not to accept, in that story about your father, Philip, I think so many of us in healthcare have seen that so many times in so many different settings in which faith is a reason not to utilize medical care, and that in some way faith is juxtaposed against science and against medicine. I think that Philip's phrase, an error in theology, I 100% agree with that there is nothing in Scripture that tells us that faith should be divorced from the study of the world that God created and the use of the intellect that God gave us to study the world that he made. And the development of vaccines is a part of that science and medicine that God has enabled us to learn and study in medicine. And in fact, arguably, if you take away the access to clean water, arguably vaccines are the single most life-saving development in the history of the world. And unfortunately, there are Christians who are among the most vocal people who resist vaccines for varying reasons. And so, yes, I think that being a voice for receiving vaccines is a really important role for CMDA, is a really important role for Christians in healthcare, and is an important issue for all of us as Christians, whether we're in healthcare or not, to really evaluate and examine and to understand whether the reasons that we're using for resisting vaccines are theologically valid or whether they are errors in theology, as to use Philip's phrase again.
Any thoughts about that, Philip?
Well, I would just second what she said. There are other aspects too. It's unfortunate that in a divided country like ours right now, I would hope that Christians would be bridge builders. And unfortunately, they seem to be perpetuating the divide. Even on something like Make America Great Again, that's a slogan which I understand. But when it comes to a global health crisis, it troubles me when a lot of people think, let's just grab all the vaccine and inoculate all Americans, and then we'll think about the rest of the world. And the rest of the world is looking very carefully at that. They're getting some sponsorship from China and other places. And America used to be known as a generous, charitable place, and it's becoming less and less that way. And I would hope, I remember a phrase that Dr. Paul Brand taught me. He said, a healthy body is not a body that feels no pain. He worked with leprosy patients. He knew that was not true. In fact, there are very unhealthy bodies because they don't feel pain. He said, a healthy body is a body that listens to the pain of the weakest part. And that's what we should be doing. It's been clear even in our own country that People of color, minorities are the most vulnerable for various reasons. We should be caring about those. We should be reaching out to them. Christians should be in the forefront of listening to those voices from the weakest parts, not only in our country, but in the world at large. And of course, many CMDA members have gone on mission trips, medical mission trips, and you can be outstanding spokesmen and spokeswomen in reminding us of the situation in the rest of the world.
Well, Philip, a major aspect of Autumn Dawn's blog article was that we see in the New Testament redemption and looking forward. And your quote in the blog, Autumn Dawn, was you realized there was redemption going on all around me. Some things that just couldn't happen before pre-pandemic that you were able to do, like sitting in the park once a week with a friend that you could almost never see in the hectic life from before. And so you were seeing redemption. But Philip, I wanted to ask, well, how have you seen God at work in the midst of this coronavirus and avoiding what I believe you shared to Autumn Dawn and the rest of the crowd there, that we should be careful about speaking for God, on behalf of God, without using his word. But what have you seen as redemption that's come out of this pandemic in 2020 and 2021?
I like to use the phrase, Mike, that pain redeemed impresses me more than pain removed. When somebody comes down with a serious illness or goes through a very hard time, naturally we want that to go away. And in our prayers, we pray for healing. And sometimes that does happen miraculously. Often it does not. That's why we call them miracles, not just ordinaries. But along comes a person like a Johnny Erickson Tada, who prays and is anointed with oil by the great healing people, faith people of her day. And she's still a quadriplegic. But she uses that disability to become a prophetess to the rest of the church. And she has done that. She started a whole ministry and awakened the church to the Christ from the disabled. And when I think of the coronavirus, I can think of ways in which God has redeemed a bad thing. Let's not say it's a good thing. It's not a good thing at all. But good can come out of bad. We're in the middle of Lent right now. And that is the Christian story. It's not that problems will go away, but it's that God can take the worst thing that can happen and turn it into a good thing. That's why we call Good Friday Good Friday. How can it be good that Jesus was killed and unjustly accused like that? Well, it was good because of what God did. He turned that into the salvation of the world. And I look at the coronavirus crisis and I see that some good has come. It's forced us to be unplugged in a different way, to spend more time with our families, to, in my case, I've never taken so many hikes in the Rocky Mountains because it's a healthy thing we can do. We wear a mask in case we run into other people, but it is good for us. And I heard early on in the UK, on average, only 5 or 6% of the population ever goes to church. It's a fairly unchurched society right now. But early on in the days of the coronavirus, as churches were going online, churches like Holy Trinity Brompton that started the Alpha program, John Stott's church in London, about 25 to 30% of people in Britain had tuned into one of those services. So here was an unexpected outreach. These people would never darken the doors of a church in Great Britain, but they're faced with this fearful global crisis, and people are dying around them. People are getting sick. At a time like that, we want answers. We want comfort. We want some solace. And they were finding it in the church. That's just one way in which God can use even a bad thing and out of it create something good.
Well, Autumn Dawn, you referred to how we're made in the image of God, and it's because of that we search for meaning and purpose, because God is a God of purpose and meaning. He provides for our lives. Have you had some recent experiences with patients where you've heard some stories of redemption in their lives?
Yes. One that really dramatically stands out to me actually is not related to coronavirus, but talking with a patient that very much ties into what we're talking about. Patient who was recently diagnosed with a pretty significant hematologic illness, and was just talking about how the patient is a believer, and it was talking about how she wants this to mean something. And I don't know exactly what I don't think she even knows exactly what she ultimately means by that, but that she wants this experience to mean something. She wants this to be, she doesn't want to squander the experience. She wants it to mean something. And to me, that's a redemptive, just the attitude going into that diagnosis and into the treatment and the experience that she's about to have. There's redemption in that. There's redemption in people who have recovered from COVID and are donating plasma to treat other people who have COVID. I actually have, this is a friend, not a patient, but I have a friend who recovered from COVID and is very, very excited. He goes and gets his antibodies checked every time he donates plasma and is very excited every time he still has antibodies because he can still keep going and donating, and he's keeping tally of how many times he's donated. And it's a smallish thing in the face of a whole pandemic, and yet it's really redemptive in the sense that a person can contribute back to the healing of a much more ill person who's, who has a more severe case of the infection. But I think all of us see that repeatedly in the lives of our patients. It's being aware of it, to me, for us being aware of it and then being able to point that out, because patients, I think, can have those experiences and not see them, not regard them, and not be aware of them themselves as well. So that's part of the redemption, is noticing those things along the way and being grateful for them and acknowledging them. I think that's one of the things that I've taken from this experience is, even like right now in Snowmageddon, as you called it, I'm very aware every time I turn on the water that I have water, and I'm not taking that for granted. So there's redemptiveness in the awareness of those little things as well.
Well, Philip, what are you working on now? What kind of projects? I mean, you've authored, what's the exact count now? How many books have you authored in your career?
About 25, I think. My latest project came directly from the pandemic. This is a project I've wanted to do for 40 years. In 1623, John Donne, great English poet, was the dean of St. Paul's Cathedral. And this pandemic, it was bubonic plague in his day, went through and killed 1/3 of London, and another third of London escaped to the countryside to get away from whatever was causing it. So that it was this deserted city, and he had this great church, St. Paul's, and people would flock for words of comfort and solace and understanding and meaning from their dean. Well, then he got sick. And he lay in his room and he would hear the church bells. You probably remember from high school literature, no man is an island, ask not for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for you. So he thought he was dying of bubonic plague, and he wrote this book, Devotions Upon Emergency Occasions, in 1623. It's a classic. It's still being used today. It's never been out of print in 400 years. But the language is so convoluted. One sentence has 234 words.
Wow. So
I went through and I did a modern paraphrase of John Donne's devotions, kind of like Ken Taylor or Eugene Peterson have done to the King James Bible, which was written in exactly the same era. And it was so rich for me because even though the medicine had changed enormously, in his day they were letting blood and they were flying pigeons to remove the evil vapors, and that was the state-of-the-art treatment. But one person wrestling with God has not changed at all. He was lying in bed thinking, why God? I'm the person you have appointed to bring comfort to this city, and instead I'm nailed to my bed, is the expression he used. And he had a rather randy past. He wondered if God was punishing him for his sins of the past. And all these questions that occur to us today, he analyzed for us and wrote down in beautiful poetry. So I had the privilege of taking one of the great books ever and modernizing it, doing a modern paraphrase. And I'm sure I profited more than anybody who will read it, but that will come out in a couple of months. It'll be called A Companion in Crisis.
It would be great if it came out just before a national convention, and then you could put in a plug when you share with us at the end of April. This has been an awesome conversation. I hate to bring it to a close, but we've run out of time. Just our listeners, I want to remind you, we are going to have a virtual national convention this year. Hopefully we will have 800 to 1,000 or more of our members attending virtually our national convention, April 29th through May 1st. Philip, thank you for last year saying yes to that invitation to be a part of this national convention.
You're welcome. And I've learned from Autumn Dawn, I probably shouldn't use the title God and the Coronavirus with physicians.
Maybe you should. Maybe people will have such a gut level reaction that it'll really get their attention.
You know, you can find Dr. Galbraith's blog article that we were discussing at cmda.org/thepoint. It will also be linked in our show notes. Dr. Galbraith boasts of having read every single book by Philip Yancey. Now, if you're inspired to do the same, we do have a couple of great books of his in the CMDA bookstore to get you started. In a prior CMDA Matters podcast, Philip and I talked about that updated classic of his written with renowned leprosy surgeon Dr. Paul Brand, entitled Fearfully and Wonderfully, The Marvel of Bearing God's Image. Dr. Paul Brand and Yancey give a spellbinding account of medical intervention, pain, healing, and the courage of humanity, discovering what it means to be made in the image of God. Christians have proclaimed the good news about Jesus for centuries, but the good news isn't sounding so good these days in some corners, at least to some. More and more surveys show that people view Christians as bearers of bad news, judgment, and intolerance. In his book, Vanishing Grace, Bringing Good News to a Deeply Divided World, best-selling author Philip Yancey acknowledges the problem and then explores how we can respond with both grace and truth. You can get a copy of one or both of these books at cmda.org/store or by calling 888-230-2637 today. Well, I'm excited to announce a brand new exclusive offer from CMDA Matters as a listener perk. During the month of March, when you make any donation to CMDA through the link in our show notes, we will send you a copy of author Carl Trueman's new book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, Cultural Amnesia, Expressive Individualism, and the Road to Sexual Revolution. Dr. Trueman will actually be my guest on CMDA Matters in the final week of this month, March. His new book has been dubbed the 2020 Book of the Year and maybe even the Decade by Reverend Andrew Walker of Southern Theological Seminary. I just finished the 407-page book myself, and I concur with Reverend Walker's high praise. So just go to cmda.org/rise and triumph, one word, rise and triumph, and use the code MATTERS2103 to claim your gift. And thanks in advance for your generosity to your CMDA. Well, as you heard me close the interview, our CMDA Virtual National Convention, Courage Through the Crisis, Stories from the Front Lines, will be here before you know it, April 29th through May 1st. And plenary talks will be given by Philip Yancey, as well as Al Mohler, Dr. Alveda King, Bible teacher Pastor Burt Jones. And I'll be kicking off the first evening of the convention, Thursday, April 29th, sharing with you under the theme, The Clarion Call of God to a Consecrated Life. There will be breakout sessions live, during which you'll have the opportunity to fellowship with like-minded healthcare professionals and get much-needed continuing education credit. You know, our Women Physicians in Christ ministry is hosting a social on March 20th intended for women dental students. This one-hour social will be hosted by Joy Kim and Ariana Farron and will help Women Physicians in Christ members get to know women dental students across the country while hearing the testimony of Caroline Miller and share how God is working in so many lives through small group discussion. You can find out more information and register for these events at cmda.org/events, or you can find links in our show notes today. Well, I'd now like to ask our Senior Vice President for Bioethics and Public Policy, Dr. Jeff Barrows, to update you on what's happening in advocacy, specifically in Washington, D.C., as it touches on Christians in healthcare.
For our Washington update, I want to make you aware of the so-called Equality Act, a radical bill now making its way through Congress. If passed, this bill will end religious conscience protections and medical judgment decisions made by health care professionals on gender issues. The U.S. House of Representatives has already passed the Equality Act by a largely partisan vote of 224 to 206. So the battle now moves to the Senate. The Equality Act would replace medical judgment with governmental coercion when it comes to treatment of children and adult patients experiencing gender dysphoria. CMDA has been fighting in court to protect our members from a similarly coercive Obama-era transgender mandate. I urge you to learn more about the Equality Act on our Freedom to Care webpage, which is found at freedom2care.org/equality-act. There you will see a letter from CMDA and Freedom to Care that details the harms that the Equality Act would force upon people of faith and pro-life health professionals. Lastly, I would urge you to contact your senators using our 10-second action form that you will find at the same webpage. That's, again, freedom2care.org/equality-act. I hope that you will take action on this very important issue today.
Well, we've had the opportunity today to hear Philip Yancey and Autumn Dawn Galbraith talk about the redeeming of pain and of relationships in the midst of coronavirus. I saw that true in my own life because I was scheduled to crisscross the United States and even the globe last year several times. But instead, as I stayed put here in Bristol, Tennessee for the most part, God gave me different opportunities as 2 of my adult children got married. 2 of them graduated, one from high school and one from nursing school. My wife and I even discovered bike riding together again here in beautiful eastern Tennessee, an activity that we enjoyed so much together during our first 2 years of marriage before kids. As Christian healthcare professionals, we know that seeing how God redeems difficult times for His own perfect plan can bring me peace, even when we're facing hardships and suffering personally. That's why sharing stories such as these today matters to CMDA and CMDA Matters. We'll be back next week, God willing, and my guest will be none other than Coco the Clown. Now, you got to be wondering about that, but how many doctors do you know who have professional training at being a clown? You won't want to miss it.
This podcast has been a production of the Christian Medical and Dental Associations. The opinions expressed by guests on this podcast are not necessarily endorsed by the Christian Medical and Dental Associations. CMDA is a nonpartisan organization that does not endorse political parties or candidates for public office. The views expressed on this podcast reflect judgments regarding principles and values held by CMDA and its members and are not intended to imply endorsement of any political party or candidate.